艾玛 Emma 是《傲慢与偏见》的作者简奥斯汀 Jane Austen 的另一篇长篇小说。艾玛是个上流社会的富家女，在她的村庄海伯里举足轻重。她善良、热心自负。文章描述了当时英国社会的爱情婚姻。该作品被多次搬上荧幕。
Chapter 9 Hartfield. Mr. Elton and his new wife received many invitations from the people of Highbury. Emma decided that she must ask them to dinner at Hartfield. As only 6 people were invited to the meal, Mr. Woodhouse was quite happy. He enjoyed having dinner with a few friends in his own home. The Eltons, the Westons, and Mr. Knightley all accepted Emma's invitation to dinner. Harriet did not want to see the Eltons, so Emma did not invite her to Hartfield. She invited Jane Fairfax. At Christmas, John Knightley had promised to bring his 2 oldest sons to Hartfield in the spring. The boys would stay with their aunt and grandfather for a few weeks. John Knightley and his young sons came for their visit on the same day as the dinner party. They arrived early in the morning. John planned to stay in Hartfield for the night and return to London early the following day. Mr. Woodhouse was very upset when his son-in-law arrived. There were now going to be 9 people at dinner, not 8. Mr. Woodhouse was uncomfortable in large groups of people. They made him feel unwell. Then Mr. Weston sent a message. He had to go to London on business and could not come to dine. There would be only 8 people at dinner, after all. Mr. Woodhouse was happy again. At 4 o'clock, all the guests for the dinner party arrived. The Eltons brought Jane with them in their carriage. Mrs. Elton looked very elegant in a dress made of lace and a long necklace of pearls. John Knightley did not like meeting strangers, but he had met Jane Fairfax many times in London. He was pleased to see Jane at Hartfield. She was a quiet, clever girl, and John Knightley enjoyed her company. They were soon talking together happily. "I hope that you did not get wet this morning before breakfast, Miss Fairfax," John Knightley said with a smile. "I saw you when I was walking in the village with my boys. It was raining heavily." "I only went to the post office," Jane answered. "I fetch the letters every morning. A walk before breakfast is good for me." John Knightley smiled. "We always like receiving letters when we are young," he said. "I am older than you, and I do not like letters so much now." "You are talking about business letters, Mr. Knightley," Jane said quickly. "I was talking about letters from friends. Many of my friends live far away. Your family and all your friends are close to you. You do not need letters from them." "My dear Miss Fairfax, I am 10 years older than you," John Knightley replied. "I am sure that in 10 years' time things will be different. You will have a loving family of your own." Jane's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she said quietly. Other people heard this conversation. Soon everybody was talking about Jane's walk to the post office in the rain. Old Mr. Woodhouse was very worried when he heard this. He spoke to Jane in his usual kind way. "Young ladies should not walk in the rain," Mr. Woodhouse said. "Miss Fairfax, you must take care of yourself. I hope that you changed your stockings when you returned to your aunt's house. Wet stockings are very dangerous." Then the kind old man added, "I am so pleased to see you here, Miss Fairfax, and my daughter is too." Mrs. Elton was not as polite as Mr. Woodhouse. "You were walking in the rain?" she cried. "What a silly girl you are! We cannot let you do that again, can we, Mrs. Weston? The servant who gets our letters from the post office can get yours too, Jane." "You are very kind, Mrs. Elton," Jane said. "But I enjoy my morning walk to the post office. I must get my own letters." Mrs. Elton laughed and shook her head. Jane turned away and began to speak to John Knightley again. Emma was listening with interest. It was clear that Jane's letters were very important to her. Did they come from Ireland? Had Jane received a letter that morning? Had she received a letter from Mr. Dixon, perhaps? Emma had noticed that Jane was looking much happier than usual. Emma smiled at her, and the two beautiful girls walked into the dining room together. They sat beside each other during dinner. Mr. Knightley was very pleased to see that Emma and Jane were becoming friends. After dinner, Mrs. Elton sat next to Jane and began talking to her in her loud voice. "I am getting worried about you, Jane," Mrs. Elton said. "It is already April, and you plan to be a governess by June. Have you had any answers to your inquiries?" "I have not made any inquiries," Jane said. "The Campbells will be in London by June, and I must spend some time with them." "But all the best positions go to people who make inquiries early," Mrs. Elton cried. "I shall tell my friends all about you. You are so clever and well educated. I must find you a position with a very good family. I know that you are shy, but I can help you. Do not worry." "Thank you," Jane said quietly. "But for the next few months I shall be staying in Highbury." At that moment everyone was surprised when Mr. Weston came into the room. "I got back from London an hour ago," he said. "I bring you good news, Anne," he said to his wife. "It has come in a letter. Read it, my dear, and you too, Emma." Mrs. Weston took the letter and smiled as she read it. It was from Frank Churchill. He was writing to say that Mrs. Churchill was tired of her home in Yorkshire. The Churchills were planning to stay in London for a few months, so Frank would be staying only 16 miles from Highbury. Mrs. Weston was as happy as her husband. Emma was not sure about her own feelings. Would she be happy to see Frank Churchill again? She would have to think about that. Mr. Weston looked around for someone to talk to about Frank. Jane Fairfax was having a conversation with John Knightley. His brother, Mr. Knightley, was frowning. It was clear that the news about the Churchills had not pleased him. So Mr. Weston sat down next to Mrs. Elton and began talking to her. "I hope that I shall soon be able to introduce my son to you," Mr. Weston said with a smile. "His name is Frank Churchill." "That name is very well known in Highbury," Mrs. Elton replied. "Mr. Elton and I will be happy to invite the young man to the vicarage." That was what Mr. Weston wanted to hear, and he was soon telling Mrs. Elton all about his son. Frank Churchill arrived in Highbury in late spring. He had been away for 2 months. His visit was very short, but he called on his father and stepmother at Randalls, as well as the Woodhouses at Hartfield. Frank greeted Emma warmly, but he greeted her as a friend. She could not see any signs of love. Did he love her, or had she been mistaken? Frank stayed at Hartfield for only 15 minutes. Then he hurried away to call on other friends. Then Frank left Highbury suddenly and returned to London for 10 days. When he came back to Highbury again, he brought more news. Mrs. Churchill did not like London after all. It was too noisy. The Churchills were moving to Richmond, a village near London, in the early summer. They planned to stay there for the months of May and June. Richmond was a very quiet place, only 12 miles away from Highbury. The Westons were very pleased. And there was more exciting news for the people of Highbury. Frank Churchill had not forgotten about the plans for a ball at the Crown Inn. He told the Westons to choose the day and make all the arrangements. The young people of Highbury were all delighted.